Good afternoon. In light of the length of the report, the statement that I make will be fairly long. But after the statement is ended, then I'm happy to stay and take questions for as long as you want to ask them. The decision to go to war in Iraq and to remove Saddam Hussein from power in a coalition of over 40 countries led by the United States of America was the hardest, most momentous, most agonizing decision I took in my 10 years as British Prime Minister. No, I think about the decision and its consequences virtually every day. You can never take a decision this large and of such extraordinary magnitude and impact on the world and it not live with you rightly for as long as you live. It should do.
Here at Westminster, the families and the world's media have been digesting the findings of the report.
This report really is a devastating denunciation of pretty much every aspect of the war.
You know, the responsibility I feel is complete and it's real. And the only thing I ever ask of people is at least to listen to what I'm saying in explaining the decision and in the fact there is another point of view about its consequences.
Gordon Brown has ruled himself out of the contest.
Tony Blair is elected leader of Labour.
Mr. Brown, having wanted to step in for so long, now gets the opportunity.
When those terrorists drove the planes into those buildings, the world changed on its axis at that moment.
Please welcome Tony Blair.
America was attacked because of what America stood for. And we stood for the same values. So when America was attacked, of course, we should be shoulder to shoulder with them. Anything else would be not just, morally suspect. It was a collective problem, the Western problem. We were going to sort it out together.
From this nation goes our deepest sympathy and prayers for the victims and our profound solidarity with the American people. We were with you at the first, we will stay with you to the last.
9/11 shocked the Americans to the core. And Tony understood that straight away and how it was absolutely critical at that moment to be as close as possible to the American people.
So honored the British Prime Minister has crossed an ocean to show his unity with America. Thank you for coming, friend.
For me, it was absolutely critical for our country that we stood with America because it was an important part of our future. That strong American relationship alongside that strong European relationship, you keep those two things strong and you will always have influence in the world. And through that influence, you protect your own interests and you protect your own values.
So the whole world's attention is now turned to Osama Bin Laden, officially named today by all and sundry as the prime suspect of the attack.
The Prime Minister has effectively delivered an ultimatum to the Taliban government in Afghanistan, saying if they fail to give up Osama Bin Laden and his followers, there'll be war.
In choosing to help the friends of terror, they are choosing to be enemies of ours.
The Prime Minister has begun 3 days of intense diplomacy in Europe and America as he seeks to play a key role in forging a global coalition against terrorism.
Tony was instrumental in assembling this astonishing international coalition, getting United Nations Security Council clearance, and then moving in.
Military action against targets inside Afghanistan has begun. We waited so that those responsible could be yielded at by those shielding them. That offer was refused. We have now no choice, and our determination in acting is total. We will not let up or rest until our objectives are met in full. Thank you.
Well, this is it. We're walking into Kabul city.
The last Taliban stronghold, Tora Bora, is reported to have fallen.
Al-Qaeda has effectively been defeated today.
The first Western leader in recent memory to visit Afghanistan, the first British Prime Minister ever on Afghan soil. Tony Blair came tonight to visit the men and women he'd sent to lead this country's recovery.
We agreed about Afghanistan. I mean, the whole world cooperated on Afghanistan, and I felt proud of what he was doing.
I think what I do feel is that the action was justified, but the action is the first step.
Where there is a problem in the world with potential consequences that spread far beyond the borders of that particular country, there are reasons not just of morality, but of enlightened self-interest to try and solve those problems.
With the aftermath of the Afghanistan campaign at the end of 2001 into 2002, the word Iraq came into the conversation quite quickly. Saddam Hussein as being the enemy, with the axis of evil mentality.
Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
It became an opportunity for an ideological American administration to deal with a dictator who might or might not have anything to do with 9/11, but who was a threat to American interests.
He's hardly been visible since September the 11th, but today the American Vice President Dick Cheney was in London. The first of 12 stops to drum up support for action against Iraq.
We have to be concerned about the potential marriage, if you will, between a terrorist organization like al-Qaeda and those who hold or are proliferating knowledge about weapons of mass destruction.
There were very good reasons for thinking Saddam had an active WMD program. He'd used it against his own people. He'd used it in the Iran-Iraq war. Hundreds of thousands of people had died.
At the moment, they're not claiming a direct link with September the 11th, rather that Iraq may supply those responsible for the outrage with weapons of mass destruction.
We have said right from the very outset, you'll have heard me say on many, many occasions, no decisions have been taken on how we deal with this threat. But that there is a threat from Saddam Hussein is not in doubt at all.
The only guidance that you can give yourself in these circumstances is to do what you think is right. You know, inaction also has its own consequence.
We hear a drumbeat that seems to be getting louder, that if the United States wanted to invade Iraq, no one was going to stop it. No one could stop it. But political opinion in Britain wouldn't understand a rush to invade Iraq without some kind of international endorsement.
Never before has Tony Blair made such an important trip across the Atlantic.
and never before has he enjoyed such influence in Washington.
I went with the Prime Minister to Camp David, which is the President's weekend retreat in Maryland, to persuade Bush that we should go to the UN.
He's arrived here to tell George W. Bush to internationalize the Iraq crisis, to get him to agree that the path to a possible war should go through the United Nations.
Politically, it was going to be extremely difficult for me. I'd been close to Bill Clinton, but he was of the same political family. George Bush was a Republican.
A lot of people understand he holds weapons of mass destruction. A lot of people understand he has invaded 2 countries. A lot of people understand he's gassed his own people.
But in the end, it was about our relationship with America. It was about the threat we faced together. And it was also about my fear that if we simply left America on its own in these circumstances, without trying to build a coalition, the consequences would be much worse.
You want to call on somebody? You don't have to if you don't want to.
Yeah, I know. I think he felt that the closer he could get to Bush, the more sway, hopefully, he would have to take this down the United Nations route.
Thank you all.
And Bush was very open about the fact, look, you know, I've got people around here who think this is a really stupid thing that we're doing, and they think we should just be get in there and, you know, do it.
We were in a small den-like room. And to my surprise, and I think to Tony Blair's surprise, Vice President Cheney was sitting there. I concluded that what the President wanted was for the Prime Minister to make the multilateral UN case in front of his Vice President, who was almost certainly hostile to that case.
Cheney looked like he'd kind of, you know, swallowed a lemon and couldn't quite understand all this United Nations malarkey. And I can remember David Manning afterwards saying, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that before. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, that was basically an American president using a British Prime Minister to persuade an American Vice President to do something he clearly didn't want the American government to do. Namely, to take it to the to go down that United Nations route.
The presidential motorcade swept towards the United Nations. George Bush was arriving to deliver one of the most important speeches of his presidency. He came to lay down a challenge to the world community to face up to Iraq.
Bush decided to overrule those in Washington who said, we're not going to go to the UN, and that he would make a speech demanding that the UN get behind a resolution to make Saddam Hussein disarm.
We will work with the UN Security Council for the necessary resolutions. But the purposes of the United States should not be doubted. The Security Council resolutions will be enforced, or action will be unavoidable.
The reason we felt it so important to try and go down the UN route was in many ways to give ourselves the time to see if we couldn't resolve it differently.
If we were going for a resolution for pinning Saddam against the wall, he would either have to throw open his doors and show exactly what he had, making clear that if he didn't take that last chance, he would suffer military action.
Tony Blair has to push the Iraq argument on, but choosing the TUC's Blackpool conference to plunge into the case for a possible war always risked a frosty welcome.
The great divide in Britain increasingly became a divide between those like us who believed there was firm evidence that Saddam was a threat.
Let it be clear, therefore, that he must be disarmed.
And those who were instinctively anti-war and anti-US and anti-George Bush.
I don't believe what Blair and Bush are saying about the war.
They want to get rid of him, but it's, you know, it's about going in there after the oil.
I think that Blair's increasing
closeness to Bush baffled people because he was seen as superficial. He was seen as right-wing, and he was seen as pursuing very narrow American interests.
According to the opinion polls, more people are opposed to an attack on Iraq than support the idea.
I never had any doubt in my mind that Saddam Hussein was a very cruel ruler, but an American-led invasion didn't seem to me the most intelligent strategy for helping the people of Iraq have a better life. I still thought there were so many very serious questions that had to be addressed.
Public skepticism about an attack on Saddam Hussein has been fueled by a lack of hard facts about the real threat Iraq poses.
Out on television and in Parliament, me doing the briefings and so forth, it was almost like we felt we were having to say, well, if you saw the stuff that we saw and if you knew what he knew and all that. And he wanted to be able to say, right, okay, I want to put as much of this out there in the public as possible so that people can see why I'm so concerned.
We have heard again and again that there is a dossier of evidence about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. Why haven't we got it up to now, and when are we going to see it?
Yeah, that was the problem. People said, you know, you're telling us, but you're not showing us. And I came to the conclusion that, very exceptionally, we should show people.
Originally, I had the intention that we wouldn't get round to publishing the dossier until we'd actually taken the key decisions. I think probably it's a better idea to bring that forward.
Whether that was sensible in retrospect, I really don't know.
Journalists sprinting to spread first news of the British case against Saddam Hussein. The release of a government document has never looked more like the launch of a bestseller.
It's an unusual step to put so much of the judgment reached by the intelligence community into the public domain. But if you're asking, was it a mistake? Then I think no.
Read it all, and again, I defy anyone to say that this cruel and sadistic dictator should be allowed any possibility of getting his hands on chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons of mass destruction.
The problem with delivering something like the dossier is the tension between getting a document which keeps to the good faith of all those who are involved with it, but at the same time is accessible to the general public.
The case, based mostly on intelligence reports, was that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction and was prepared to use them. He could fire chemical and biological weapons within 45 minutes of the order being given.
Not long before the dossier was finally completed, intelligence arrived from a regular and reliable source that contained this reference to chemical weapon systems being available for use within 45 minutes. Well, the headlines, I think, in The Sun and the Evening Standard were all about 45 minutes from doom. There was never any sense in the Joint Intelligence Committee assessments, or indeed the published dossier, that we were talking about direct threats to the United Kingdom.
Anyone who wanted to see the evidence, we were showing the evidence to. But it was, I think, it was a very difficult thing to do, to put out that information in that way. It's just at the time, the pressure to do so was enormous.
For Saddam Hussein, this is the moment of truth. After 4 years, UN inspectors are back in town, and the choice for the Iraqi leader is stark.
We got the inspectors in, and we just needed the Iraqis to give full cooperation to the inspectors.
We have come here for one single reason, and that is because the world wants to have assurances that there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
I remember once in the middle of the night thinking, hang on a minute. If there aren't any weapons of mass destruction, and if we knew that, you know, if that became clear, then of course there won't be a conflict.
I was determined to do everything I could to avoid it if we could. Of course, I mean, with a decision like that and with the consequences, I mean, you wouldn't be human if you didn't agonize over it and find it incredibly difficult and very stressful. And I should imagine I was complete hell to live with during those months.
We needed the WMD to be found. And without it, we were going to be on the back foot.
By February, Blix is not finding weapons of mass destruction. It is also clear that Saddam Hussein is only cooperating minimally. And the Americans are concluding that this is an exercise that's going nowhere.
We wrote 1441 to give Iraq one last chance. Iraq is not so far taking that one last chance.
I saw that at each point down the track, the gate-marked war became wider and the gate-marked peace became narrower and more difficult to get through.
The American presence in the Gulf is getting stronger by the day. Tens of thousands of US soldiers are already stationed in Kuwait.
The Security Council were determined that there should be another UN vote before any military action happened. Well, they could see American military preparations. They could hear the drumbeats of war.
The tempo of the military build-up made it more and more difficult. And the more strident became the voices on the US side, which said, forget the UN, just do it.
The whole time there was the pressure from the United States because Saddam wasn't going to back down completely. They were going to remove it. This is where ultimately we were in a situation where you had then to decide were you going to be with them or you could have just taken yourself aside from it. I particularly was very anxious to try and find a different way through if I could. But in the end, if I couldn't, and if I came to the view that Saddam was not going to change his ways, then I was going to be with America. And that's the decision in the end you had to come to. You either were with America or not, and you left him in place, Saddam, or you didn't.
Prime ministers don't get elected to go to war. Now, by the time we came to Iraq, of course, we'd already fought Kosovo in '99, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan. So by that stage, he was a bit battle-hardened to these things. But certainly it was not something he came into politics to do.
Well, I remained of the view that it was such a foolish enterprise that it was avoidable. And of course, I was dedicated to that task. Looking back, I think if Robin Cook and I and Gordon had stood together and said no, we could have stopped it. But even Robin didn't talk much in cabinet. He'd been downgraded from Foreign Secretary. And Gordon was sitting on the sidelines deciding which way to jump, and I was burbling on and being managed.
Tony did centralise decisions in a small group. It was effectively a kitchen cabinet. It wasn't really ministers, it was advisors. And so SOFA government became, if you like, a closed circle. I did not get the information that I asked for.
Brown was marginalised and sort of in his den, kind of sulking, and he wasn't in on the picture. And I think he was also calculating what's going to happen, will it go wrong, will it go right?
My immediate team was very anxious and very conflicted because it was a difficult decision. Even if people like myself don't always show the emotion over it, because it's not particularly what I want to do or think is the right way of doing things, it doesn't mean to say you don't feel that emotion. But in the end, that can't determine your decision.
I don't remember him ever looking defeated during the Iraq process. I do remember him feeling exhausted, uncertain, questioning whether he was going down the right course. That was etched on his face many times. We didn't fail to notice that there were a very large number of people against this subject.
Well, this was me and the department. This was our serious consideration of the situation. Dear Tony, the situation of the Iraqi people is already extremely fragile. Any disruption could lead to a humanitarian catastrophe. With some more time, sensible measures can be taken to reduce these risks and improve Iraq's prospects for stability after conflict. US preparations to date have been dominated by military considerations. Plans for the provision of humanitarian assistance during and following any conflict appear quite comprehensive, but rely on naive assumptions that there will be no major problem. More can be done to factor human...
You're convinced you're doing the right thing. But being a realist, you also know there's a large part of the country who will never convince that you're doing the right thing.
The march was a big thing. That was a lot of people, and I always had a golden rule on marches. If there's 5 people on a march, 50 people thought about going.
And the striking thing about it wasn't just the people you would normally see on left-wing marches. There was a very broad spectrum of society who just felt that the war was wrong.
My wife and daughter, who was 2 at the time, had gone to join the march, complete with a little handwritten poster against the war. So there was I sitting at home trying to help Tony Blair get into the war, and my family were out protesting against it.
My son was on that demonstration with his church, and he sent me a text and said, "This is so powerful. Tony will have to listen to the country. This will work."
The fact that so many people marched in that way, of course, you take account of that. It's not that you don't listen to it, but there is another point of view. But I had already understood this was going to be extremely politically treacherous. But I'd already decided in my own mind that you can't take the decision on that basis. And therefore I thought, if I don't, for political reasons, if I back off this decision, which I think is the right thing to do, well, what does that say about me as Prime Minister?
Tonight, Britain is on the brink of war. For the Prime Minister, this is the final countdown.
I want to know what he has to say to all the innocent children he's about to sacrifice.
I want to ask him why, in a democratic society, he's going against the wishes of the people.
One thing I never did was disrespect the people who disagreed with me over it.
Mr. Blair, you're attacking Iraq with George Bush, and it's not dissimilar to what Bin Laden or the al-Qaeda network done to America. They killed 3,000 or more innocent victims. How many innocent victims are you going to kill, and how many people?
We used to think this was real masochism. But for him, this was about, I know I've taken you into very dark places. You have the right to have a go at me about it.
Whenever you take military action, it is true that innocent people die as well as guilty ones, but sometimes you have to take that action.
It is painful. I mean, of course it's painful. I mean, it's not possible for it to be otherwise, because it's You're talking about people's lives.
Don't you think it's going to exacerbate?
And no matter how much personal pain it causes you, your job is to take that decision. I think it's just, I can't put it in any other way than that. And if you're not prepared to do that, you shouldn't be in the job.
If this goes badly, you're finished really, aren't you?
Well, let's wait and see, Trevor, shall we, about that? As to whether it goes badly, because I don't intend it to go badly. I'm working to get the second UN resolution.
The diplomatic process has almost collapsed and the war with Iraq could start within a few days.
For the first time, the French President Jacques Chirac said that whatever happens, he would veto any resolution authorizing war.
And at that point, it was over, frankly. And yes, I did feel very, very sorry about it. I'd wanted this problem to be resolved multilaterally through the UN. It was now clearly not going to happen.
At the United Nations, this is the man who's laboured night and day trying to save Tony Blair from his nightmare, war without a new UN resolution. But today, Britain's ambassador threw in the towel, accusing the French of...
I had to make the statement that diplomacy had nothing more to offer. That was the moment when my profession had failed. And we knew that a dangerous war was about to start. You have to get the words exactly right, but yes, you have a bit of paper in your hand. You're under instruction.
Given this situation, the co-sponsors have agreed that we will not pursue a vote on the draft UK-US-Spanish resolution. The co-sponsors reserve their right to take their own steps to secure the disarmament of Iraq.
The point of diplomacy is to win your objective without people dying. And people were going to die.
Here, the prospect of war has claimed its first big political casualty. This afternoon, Robin Cook, once Foreign Secretary, resigned from Tony Blair's cabinet. He said he couldn't support war without international agreement or domestic support.
My fellow citizens, events in Iraq have now reached the final days of decision. The United Nations Security Council has not lived up to its responsibilities. Many nations, however, do have the resolve and fortitude to act against this threat to peace. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict.
Once you've made your decision and you're going down a particular path, then you carry on with it, but it's not. You're aware of course, that it's of huge consequence, what you're doing. And so the uppermost feeling is anxiety because you don't know what comes next.
Good evening from Westminster, where Tony Blair's facing the biggest political battle of his career. With Britain on the brink of war, he's trying to persuade MPs to back his decision to send troops into battle in Iraq.
The parliamentary vote was being watched right around the world. Yeah, that was a big moment.
The lead up to that vote was agonizingly tense. If we lose that vote, it just would have destroyed the credibility and legitimacy of the government. It would have been disastrous.
Tony was sitting in his office in the House of Commons, and MPs were being brought into him, ones, twos and threes, and then other ministers were sitting in other rooms along that same corridor. All the ministers have their offices, and they're being brought in, and whips were trying to find them in corridors and bring them in and try and persuade them.
We all had our lists, we all had people we were talking to, trying to just persuade them to stick with the government.
Very fraught atmosphere, people not sleeping, people very worried. There was this immense arm twisting going on. Very unpleasant.
Would you accept, looking at what's happening in the House of Commons just now and over the last few weeks, that the relationship between the Labour Party leadership and its backbenchers has been damaged, that something has changed these past few weeks?
Well, like the rest of the country, people are expressing their doubts and anxieties. But we as a Labour government must act in the national interest.
At a moment of national difficulty, peace and war, you have to support the Prime Minister unless you've got evidence that this was not the case. You know, and people talk about personal ambition and everything else. For me, what mattered was that if the Prime Minister was saying that this was correct and that there was evidence, then, and I had no evidence to refute that, I should support him.
Outside tonight, in the final minutes before the vote, the crowds were large and angry. Inside, Labour loyalists were begging for every last vote.
Well, I'm here because if the war begins, President Bush and the Prime Minister will be taking decisions to kill women and children and thousands of innocent Iraqis, and it would be wrong. This is a question of right and wrong.
Get back! Get back!
The leader's responsibility is to lead. It's to take the decision and stand by the decision. And if, in the end, people condemn you for it, and public opinion moves against you on it, well, that's just the way it is.
The question most often posed is not why does it matter, but why does it matter so much?
There's no other way of doing the job, I think, with any form of integrity than that.
This is not the time to falter.
And worrying about how the military action would end up, worrying because people were going to get killed. And the burden on Tony was far greater.
How brilliant was it? You know, there's something about the drama of the moment that makes things seem more fine than maybe they are. If you'd asked me before if loyalty was a good quality, I would have said, of course it is, but not always. It can make people go along with things that they don't agree with because they're being loyal.
The ayes to the right, 412. The noes to the left, 149.
It was a relief that we'd succeeded, but that's when the hard bit began, which was preparing for war and sort of hunkering down, realizing this is going to be serious and people were going to die.
I think you do pause. You do step back and think about the lives involved. You do step back and think, what are we doing? How's this going to turn out?
President Bush's dramatic 48-hour deadline given to Saddam Hussein and his sons, telling them to leave Iraq or face war, has just passed.
Well, today Saddam Hussein has promised victory in any war, vowing it will be the country's last battle.
Of course, now anxious at this time. Thousands of Iraqis have been trying to flee their country. Many have already crossed frontiers into neighboring countries.
Journalists, and there seems no sign that they're going to budge. Saddam Hussein is not leaving the country, and neither are his two sons. But for all this defiance, the truth is, for ordinary Iraqis, time is running out.
Tuesday night, I gave the order for British forces to take part in military action in Iraq. Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea. Their mission? To remove Saddam Hussein from power and disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction.
Colonel Powell phoned me. It was in the small hours to say it had started. course you remember these things. I mean, how could you not? And the film of explosions in Baghdad, thinking about the people who'd be killed. Yeah. I still remember turning on the television in the morning and seeing this. Yeah. And then going to work and getting on with it, because I was not paid to be paralyzed. I was paid to make decisions. I got a call at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the switchboard at number 10 put through a military officer who, in very clipped voice, told me that a Chinook had gone down with 8 Marines and 4 American servicemen, I think. And it was really, that's when it gets you in the stomach, when you realize this is real, that people are dying. That's when it really comes home to you.
You hoped for the moment whenever the sun would come up and everything would be okay again.
This is Tony Blair, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I'm glad to be able to speak to you today to tell you that Saddam Hussein's regime is collapsing, that the years of brutality, oppression, and fear are coming to an end. Our enemy is Saddam and his regime, not the Iraqi people. Our forces are friends and liberators of the Iraqi people, not your conquerors. And they will not stay in Iraq a day longer than is necessary. So it is in the spirit of friendship and goodwill that we now offer our help. Thank you.
I think they believe their own propaganda that Saddam Hussein was so unpopular that there'd be flowers in the street welcoming the invading forces, the liberation of the people of Iraq. And of course, if that's so, it's not such a hard job, is it?
In southern Iraq, fixing essential services, including water, electricity and fuel supplies, is still the main priority there.
Under Saddam Hussein, basic services often just collapsed through neglect, and fixing water pipelines now is an essential way of winning the peace. The military don't quite make it up as they go along, but they do try to make it happen.
I think the failure was not that we didn't do the planning. We did the planning, but we just planned for completely the wrong things. We weren't anticipating what actually happened. We towed millions of tons of water into Iraq. We thought he might set fire to the oil wells. We just planned for completely the wrong thing. And where it went wrong was the Americans didn't have enough troops when they went in. So they were able to do a very light touch invasion. The trouble with a light touch invasion is you don't then have the troops to maintain law and order. So when the looting started, then things just went haywire.
What the battles didn't destroy, the people are demolishing. Looters were raiding a truck of food and water. The British troops here struggled to keep the peace.
It was about our inability to provide safety, security in Iraq after we went in, and our failure to help build institutions. We collapsed the Ba'ath Party, we collapsed the army, and we provided nothing instead.
Britain says it's here to give Iraq a future, but the building blocks for that today in Basra are coming down.
The chaos and the suffering that flowed. I mean, now everyone says, well, you don't invade a country without a plan about what you do afterwards. Well, there wasn't a serious plan, which is disgraceful.
No one can possibly dispute there were serious mistakes made in the aftermath. All I say to people is it was going to be difficult whatever you did.
We'd gone to Iraq in what was our first visit after the war, and so it all seemed to be good news.
Well, it's really good of you to have me here today. And when people look back on this time and look back on this conflict, I honestly believe they will see this as one of the defining moments of our century. And you did it. And thank you.
Prime Minister, thank you very much.
It must have been about 6:30 UK time.
Yeah.
I got a phone call from London from the duty press officer. And if you get a phone call at 6:30 in the morning, it generally isn't good news. The basic message was that Andrew Gilligan on the Today programme had accused the Prime Minister of knowing that the intelligence was wrong before we went to war.
The government's facing more questions this morning over its claims about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Our defence correspondent is Andrew Gilligan. This in particular, Andy, is Tony Blair saying they'd be ready to go within 45 minutes.
That's right, that was a central claim in his dossier which he published in September, the main case, if you like, against Iraq. And what we've been told by one of the senior officials in charge of drawing up that dossier was that the government probably knew that that 45-minute figure was wrong even before it decided to put it in. And Downing Street, our source says, ordered, a week before publication, ordered it to be sexed up, to be made more exciting.
A sunny day in Basra suddenly had a large cloud over it.
That is about as bad and as toxic as you can get. He basically just said that we, the government, Tony Blair, doctored, quote, sexed up, I think we all know what he meant, to put things in there that weren't true, against the wishes of the intelligence agencies. I mean, it was a lie on every level.
You have to be able to prove to people that you acted in good faith, because if you didn't act in good faith, obviously that would be monstrous.
Oh, he's here, thanks.
He's here?
John,
Get the chair in. Well, now we are joined by Alistair Campbell, a rare moment. Thank you for coming in. This row between you and the BBC...
This isn't a row between me and the BBC. This is an attempt by the government to get the BBC to admit that a fundamental attack upon the integrity of the government, the Prime Minister, the intelligence agencies, let alone people, the evil spin doctors in the dark who do their dirty works in the minds of a lot of journalists, let them just accept for once they have got it wrong.
It is obvious from what the Today programme has said, if that source is to be believed, that of course there was somebody from within the intelligence community that spoke to the media.
I was told that someone who was not actually an employee of the MOD but was on some sort of contract had come forward and suggested that he might have been the person who was responsible for the briefing.
The row between the BBC and the government over its weapons dossier took an extraordinary new twist tonight. The Ministry of Defence said one of its officials had admitted meeting the BBC correspondent at the centre of the row, Andrew Gilligan.
I was very, very aware that for the individual who was at the heart of this, this was not going to be a pleasant experience.
A body has been discovered in remote woodland in Oxfordshire, 2 miles from the home of senior government advisor Dr. David Kelly. Dr. Kelly, who's 50...
It was a terrible tragedy and something that should not have happened.
He'd been under intense media scrutiny since he gave evidence to the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee earlier this week.
Not enough care was taken by the Ministry of Defence, or indeed by government more generally, to have regard to the kinds of pressures that were on a very sensitive individual.
This is an absolutely terrible tragedy. I'm profoundly saddened for David Kelly and for his family. He was a fine public servant who did an immense amount of good for his country in the past, and I'm sure would have done so again in the future.
David Kelly's death, I think, had an effect on all of us, because it did bring to a sharp focus the underlying bitterness that had been there and germinating throughout the whole debate on Iraq.
You cannot allow people to think that you deliberately misled them, which of course we hadn't.
As the snow falls on Westminster tonight, Mr. Blair can take comfort from the fact he's safe in his job. But he now has another longer fight ahead of him to restore the electorate's trust in him.
I think the long-term difficulty with Iraq was it eroded trust. Clearly the public believed that they had not been told the full truth. You see, the definition of a just war includes the action has got to be proportionate, and you've got to have taken every step. It's a last resort. Now, if Saddam Hussein did not have chemical and biological weapons, and if he wasn't planning nuclear weaponry, then the action we were taking was not proportionate.
Well, indeed, the search for Iraq's weapons has found none so far, but now that search is set to intensify.
We were completely convinced that he had weapons of mass destruction. So as it went on, we kept getting stories that we were just about to find something, we're just about to find something.
The plain fact is that 6 months after we went to war because of a clear and present danger, no clear and present danger has been found.
I could see him believing they were going to be found, and then hoping, and then realizing.
It chilled the bones. It was the moment I dreaded. I think we all gradually became aware that we weren't going to find the WMD.
It was a devastating blow because the assessments were genuinely believed. The intelligence community thought it had good sources. The sad fact is the intelligence which was relied on turned out to be not reliable.
I mean, that had been put forward as the basis for military action. So it was obviously, given that the decision was already controversial, it was going to be subject to enormous criticism, and some people would be saying, well, you always knew it was wrong. You know, that the good faith point is really, really important, because, you know, otherwise, of course, the destructive impact on politics, never mind the decision itself, would be huge.
The evidence about Saddam having actual biological and chemical weapons, as opposed to the capability to develop them, has turned out to be wrong. I acknowledge that. I accept it. But I can't sincerely, at least, apologize for removing Saddam.
But he didn't get very much further before the first interruption, a lone protester shouting that Mr. Blair had blood on his hands.
No, that's fine, sir. You can make your protest. Just thank goodness we live in a democracy and you can.
You have to know that Tony is a very, 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 very good presenter. But, I mean, it's true in politics. If you've done something, you tend to defend yourself. I mean, if he now said, you know, something, I made a mistake, I mean, that would be a crumbling of his kind of persona, wouldn't it? So he has to keep going with it.
To cut straight to the point, The thing I reproach myself for, more than anyone else reproaches me, and the mistake that we made was very, very clear. And it wasn't a mistake of deceit, and it wasn't a mistake even particularly of organization. It was a failure to understand that the Middle East is gripped by deep forces, particularly of religious-based extremism. Once you remove the dictator, those forces erupt and make it extremely difficult to govern the aftermath. I mean, there's no point in look, I'm just not of the school of politics that thinks it's a great thing just to keep displaying your emotions to people. It's not the relevant point. You know, in the end, my emotions are not the important thing. What I feel is not the important thing. These questions of legacy and how people view my government or view the decision on Iraq, it's not something, I don't spend my time worrying about that. I do spend my time worrying about where the Middle East goes and the place of Iraq within it. Yes, I do, because I feel responsibility for it. But the questions of legacy is not going to be determined by me. It's going to be determined by history.
Labour have won a third consecutive term in office.
I knew I was much more weak, and there would be constant pressure on me to go.
Will Tony Blair, like Margaret Thatcher, be forced out of office by his own party?
Everybody's a shelf life in politics. You can't expect that people are going to like you if you've been around for too long.
Financial markets around the world went into free fall today.
When the economy collapses, basically your time's up.
I sort of thought that was the end. Not just of him, but of New Labour.